Well, hi, welcome to Habitual Excellence. I'm Mark Graban from Value Capture, and we're very happy to be joined today by Professor Aravind Chandrasekaran from The Ohio State University. How are you?
Very good, Mark. Thanks for having me.
So in terms of introductions, and I'll ask you to elaborate a little bit more on your roles and your involvement there. You're Professor of Operations, Associate Dean for Executive Education, and Academic Director of a program I'm familiar with and really like a lot called the MBOE program. So can you tell the listeners what MBOE stands for and tell us more about the program and your work there?
Absolutely. So MBOE stands for the Master of Business and Operational Excellence. And it's a program actually precedes me. 10 years ago, Jim Womack and John Shirk, as you all know from the LEI, along with one of the professors here, Peter Watt, actually talked about how do we create an education around operational excellence and lean that is beyond the traditional way a management degree is offered. And they thought about this very carefully, and they spent a lot of time in terms of designing this, and in came the MBOE program. So this MBOE program is catered around executive masters. It's all about creating a culture of continuous improvement and sustaining those cultures of a continuous improvement. And then what are some skill sets that you as a leader should develop in order to maintain those things? So it's a 9-month, it's actually a 13-month MBA program where students actually come in for 8 different sessions. And they spend about 4 days here at Ohio State. And what we walk them through is this whole idea of problem solving, problem framing, and how do you actually implement changes? How do you sustain those changes in a way that whatever you end up doing is actually lasting beyond your role in the organization? So it's been, I would say, a very honor in my side to really take over this program after Peter Watt. And we've done some more innovation in this program to actually bring in those high levels of leadership and analytical skills in a way our students not only apply. So what is the main thing in our program is that we don't really interviews are slightly different, where students actually come with a problem. And then we help them solve this problem back in their organization. And in doing so, I know you, Mark, at some point have served as a coach in those programs. So we have really reputable coaches like you actually helping that students in those journey. And by the end of their journey at the MBOE, they're not only acquiring this problem-solving skills, but they're actually solving a real problem in their organization and sustaining them. So that's the way the program really works. And we have really blessed in terms of having excellent alumni all over the world. And several of them are actually having leadership positions both in the US and across the US. So it's been a real pleasure for me to actually manage this program.
Yeah, well, that's great. And backing up a little bit in your own career, maybe when we talk about some of your PhD work and how you came to run across Paul ONeill, who, of course, the late Paul ONeill, who was one of the founders of Value Capture, who we often end up talking about here on the podcast. What are some of your recollections?
Absolutely. So my PhD was actually in the area of continuous improvement and innovation. So I did my PhD from the University of Minnesota, and I did my PhD under my advisors, Kevin Linderman, who actually wrote a seminal paper on Six Sigma, and Roger Schroeder, who actually was, I would call, one of the pioneers in the area of quality management in Minnesota. So both Roger and Kevin were what we call as empirical researchers. So really understanding how a problem is happening, why organizations don't really have quality advantage, or why they get something to be really good, but then they fail in their journey. So that's always been how Kevin and Roger did some work, and I was able to work with them. And very quickly in my PhD days, I got introduced to some of the work that Paul ONeill did at Alcoa. And we all know about the famous story about him marching in day one and talking about how he's going to prioritize worker safety, and how not only those were words, but there were actions around it, and there were a process around it, there were a cadence around it, and then fast forward, we all know what happened at Alcoa and so many other organizations. So that was a very powerful thing for me when I was introduced to the idea around leading by actually showing and by setting some examples. So in fact, Joe Juran, that you may all know, one of the quality gurus, was a part of University of Minnesota's Juran Center for Quality. And we did, through those journey, we did actually have Paul ONeill participate in a couple of summits. This was way back in early 2000s. And I could say I was very honored meeting him, like in very early in my PhD days. But more than meeting him, I think what some of his works that he has done, some of the actions that he has done in Alcoa and even around Alcoa, beyond Alcoa, what he did in terms of value capture in the healthcare field, I think it influenced a lot of researchers, including me.
Yeah. And as you've moved forward now in continuing your research, I know a topic that you've looked into a lot and spent a lot of time on is psychological safety. And I think maybe many listeners would agree that continuous improvement and the engagement of frontline staff requires a great deal of psychological safety. So I was wondering, first off, how do you define psychological safety for a listener who's maybe not familiar with the concept?
Yeah, and again, it's not my definition. Is actually the term and the work around psychological safety was championed by Professor Amy Edmondson, that you may all know from Harvard Business School, where she talks about the ability for frontline to actually speak up openly and take risk in their day-to-day actions and not feel punitive or not worry about the actions of taking risk. So Amy and others following Amy Edmondson have done some excellent work in terms of measuring it. And what I try to do is actually take some of the things that they have done, and I try to study how do you really develop psychological safety. We all know from several research works that psychological safety is very important. But I ask the question of how do you really create an environment where psychological safety is developed? And I study that in various contexts. In my PhD days, I studied this in the context of research and development. So if you think about, I studied several Fortune 500 companies, and I really wanted to understand why certain scientists in certain companies were really innovating better than the others. And if you keep asking those questions, you end up saying that it's the culture of the organization. But then we all know culture is so big. So if you go deeper into it and really get to the crux of it, you see that they're actually okay failing. They're actually okay learning from those failures. They're okay celebrating those failures. So then if you really go on and you see that, and we studied this across about 30 companies, we found that the really successful product development teams in those companies really was good in psychological safety. So when we measured those teams, how are they doing in terms of psychological safety? And we found that they were really, really good. Fast forward, what we wanted to study was how were they getting the psychological safety? And this goes back to what Paul ONeill actually said in terms of creating a process around it, creating visibility of, okay, if there is a problem out there, then I've got to know. I still remember that vignette about him, a plant employee from Alcoa talking about, I can't operate, it's not safe. Of course, he talks about a different kind of safety, human safety, but the same concept applies here. So what we found, in essence, in really high-performing R&D companies, where they were really doing well, is because they were creating a process around it, they were creating metrics around it, they were okay allowing the R&D teams to fail. More importantly, they were actually more interested in learning from those failures. How do you really learn from those failures? What can I learn as an organization? And I can use it because there are so many other people in my same organization working on similar kind of ideas. So how do I now take that message and create a learning so that others can not do the same message, or they might do an experiment to learn differently? So that culture was a critical factor in my days when I looked at it from a context of R&D manufacturing. I've also done similar things, if you want me to talk about, in healthcare, because I think we all see in this day and age, especially with COVID-19, the importance of frontline workers to actually own processes, to actually do well along those lines. And we find oftentimes there is fear about trying, fear about learning, and we do see psychological safety being a critical factor in terms of making sure that they're able to do their job well.
I mean, I think one of the things that's really interesting about that, I think now amongst many people famous Paul ONeill story was when that employee spoke up about the safety problem at the plant. Mr. ONeill had been there and he gave them his home phone number and told them, if you're not getting the right response locally from in terms of safety to call me. So I wonder, like, was it? I mean, it took some amount of feeling psychologically safe to actually pick up the phone and call Mr. O'Neill, but maybe being given that permission by the CEO was a great step forward
Absolutely.
creating that, right?
And then think about it, I'll go one further, is like making sure the CEO was there in the front line of the plant. Like we all know, and we see increasingly that's happening, but oftentimes people think that the role of a C-suite leader is to stay in his or her cubicle and then work. But this cadence around how do I go to the front line? And of course, you can't spend all your time in the front line, but how do I reassure that, right? So Paul O'Neill is a great example of how that happened. It's like, and that gave the confidence for the frontline people to say, hey, this person is looking after me and has given my phone number, so why not call and check, right? And it was good that he picked up the phone. So rather than having it go for a voicemail, he picked up the phone. And I think the story goes as the call was at 9 p.m. and at 4 a.m. in the morning, the problem was solved. Yeah. So that's another important thing, is not just escalating problems, but solving that problem immediately gives more confidence for workers to say, I can speak up more. And that's another important thing about how do you create that environment. So.
Yeah. So I'm curious, in your research in the different organizations that you've looked at, how often is the CEO directly involved in trying to help create that culture of psychological safety? Is that helpful, important, necessary? What do you see?
I do see increasingly it's happening. So, I mean, I've been studying this whole phenomena for the last, I would say, 15 years or so. If you had asked me this question 15 years ago, I would say probably not that often. I do see now there is some, the good thing is people are learning. There is good ways that they have understood the importance of, you all have heard this term going to Gemba, right? So they are all moving and making sure that they are in Gembas. And that helps a lot. Again, from a standpoint of, there are some examples, I'm sure in your podcast at some point you might have had about this gentleman named Billy Taylor. Yes, Billy, again, is a great example of a frontline person. He used to manage Goodyear. And again, one of the stories goes by in a Goodyear plant in North Carolina, very similar to what happened in Alcoa. Again, employee morale was down, turnovers were high, and he goes by the story, and there is a nice story around it, and very well written too, is how he transformed the morale of the plant in a year difference, and how and the story goes as he was there in the morning every day, beating up the thing to make sure that they were there. So that kind of, you do see more and more of the Billy Taylors that are actually right now working. In the healthcare field, we've heard great examples. I've seen some of them actually come into your whole podcast. And John Toussaint being a person that I've seen going, I remember a story about John going to a local hospital in Theta K, one of the regional units having a problem, going there and really asking the question, not solving the problem, but asking the question. So you do see increasingly in organizations, and by the way, it need not be a CEO. So that's another thing that we did a study in I wouldn't name the organization, but it's a very well-known healthcare organization in the world. Everybody would know this organization. Unfortunately, I have to keep it confidential. But we did a study where we did what we call as experiments. So the way I do research is I do kind of randomized controlled experiments, or even experiments in the organization by trying to do some things and not trying to do the other things. So in one study, we wanted to study daily huddles. So we wanted to study our daily huddles, which we always talk about, are they really effective? And when I say effective, is it really improving psychological safety? Is it really improving team morale? And more importantly, does it really help in terms of getting patients seen better, especially in a primary care kind of setting? So we wanted to study this question. So we ended up doing a randomized controlled experiment in a big healthcare institution. We had about 50 different primary care sites. We randomized them. In a randomized controlled experiment, you give an intervention to one, and it's kind of a placebo to the other, where you don't really give an intervention. And the intervention in this case was making sure that they have a huddle, and we did that. And we wanted to see the result after about 6 months of their huddling. And it was surprising, Mark, here. In what we found was even in the what we call as a treatment arm, where they were huddling, There was no difference in psychological safety. We measured psychological safety, we measured team cohesiveness, team performance, we measured some patient outcomes. We found that none of those things changed. It was kind of a surprise for us. Why didn't, since they're huddling every day, they're coming together every day, why is this team not doing well? I mean, one would expect a priori that they should do well and people have to think. And when we say the team, in this context, it was a primary care physician, nurses, social workers all coming together on a daily basis to problem solve. What then really happened was when we looked deep into what really was happening there was even in the teams that were doing huddles, you could clearly see that certain teams actually had the physician lead of the particular primary care team every day in the huddle. In other teams, when they were huddling, the physician lead was not there in the front line in the huddle. That was a big difference. So the teams, when we then removed that and understood, we found the teams where they were huddling every day, where the lead physician of the unit was there in the front line every day, helping them problem solve. You had increase in psychological safety, you had better team cohesion, in fact, improved patient satisfaction, and so on and so forth. In the teams where actually they were just huddling, but the physician lead of that particular unit was not on the front line every day. We even measured attendance. So the way we did was, okay, these are primary care sites, so they are all Monday to Friday. So we were actually measuring how many of those sites were happening 5 days a week, and how many of those 5-day huddles you had the primary care physician in the front of the huddle. We found that in those cases where the lead physician of the team was not there in the huddle, in those cases, psychological safety went down.
Yeah.
So you could really see, going back to your original question, leadership really matters. But when people say leadership matters, it's not just like, I approve this initiative in your organization, I support it. What do you do? And that's where I think Paul ONeill did that, where, okay, I'm not just going to say I'll throw out some money out there or I'll buy you another way to you can actually use a conveyor belt differently. Let me be there. Let me make a difference. Let me show you that I care about you. And that's the main thing. So one of the things that I learned is it's not the learning by showing yourself on the ground, helping others learn about it. It's very critical in terms of improving psychological safety.
Yeah. Because I mean, from what I've seen in different organizations, and I hear you saying some of not all huddles are created equally.
Yeah.
There are many factors or variables or dimensions. You touched on the physician leader involvement and psychological safety. In the one article that you had sent me, I had a chance to read about the design of a protocol for evaluating huddles. One of the factors in here was problem-solving training. I can imagine, I'd like to elaborate on this, but like, if we have a huddle and we're asking people to speak up about problems, but then the problems aren't being solved, not just quickly, but actually effectively. When we talk about root cause problem solving, what did you find? So this article was about the design of the study. What did you see as you carried forward with it?
So sure, and we know one thing, right? When you do huddles, the worst place to problem solve is during the huddles.
Yeah.
So huddles are 15-minute activities. And if you want to solve problems in 15 minutes, good luck with that. I mean, what's going to happen is 15 minutes becomes 30 or 45 minutes, and people get frustrated. So we found that those kind of things were happening. So in teams that were not successful in huddling, we found that people are actually solving problems in the huddles. But we all know huddles are a place where you surface out problems.
Right.
Surface out problems, and then you have other times in the day of the clinic or in the day of where they can actually solve or identify that.
Right.
The other important thing that we found was people were not really understanding and categorizing problems. So not all problems have a solution immediately, right? So we know that. So some of those problems that they were surfacing out in those huddles, they were chronic problems that required a cultural change. So if you ask the teams to actually report out on the solution tomorrow, because you met today on that problem, good luck with that. The morale of that team is going to go down. So you've got to understand, again, how do I quantify those problems into like near quick wins versus some more strategic problems, because some things might be like kept in the buffer because you don't have resources, you have other initiatives coming. So what we found was those are all some things that were really happening when people really appreciated the huddles, but people really didn't understand how to think about problem solving. and they were doing a lot of different things which they should not do. And that was a critical factor in terms of teams that really sustained versus not sustained those huddles.
Yeah. So maybe two other questions for you. One is kind of about the design of research like this, because when I think of a placebo as a non-physician and someone who's not a researcher, I think of a placebo, kind of classic example is I take a pill, I don't know if it's medicine or a sugar pill. In field research like this with huddles, I mean, people know if they're doing a huddle or not, or is the placebo some variable that they may or may not be aware of?
So that's a very good question, Mark, because again, one of the things when you do field experiments, and especially in process improvement and operational excellence, is there is learning across sites. So I teach you, you are by randomization mechanism, you are into the treatment arm. I teach you how to huddle. And it's very easy for you to meet another team, which may not be in the same facility for you, but maybe 2 miles away, or you know somebody else there. And you might tell them what you're learning. And that way, that team, which was supposed to be in the control of the placebo group, can easily learn from you. So to do that, what typically we try to do is we try to provide different ways of creating intervention. So in our study, for instance, the placebo group and the treatment group both got some ideas about what huddles are. So we gave them general information for them saying, here is the reason why you should all huddle. The Institute of Health, the Joint Commission talks about the importance of huddles, so you should all huddle. So that was a general information given to both the teams. Mm-hmm. Now for the treatment teams, which means like the placebo was not given, some intervention was given, we ended up teaching them. We ended up having them come for a 2-day workshop to say how you should huddle differently. And we ended up having a coach that was teaching them. So very similar to what we do in our MBOE program, we ended up actually teaching them the basics of operational excellence, but also having a cadence around it. And the coach was there for the first 3 months, and then they left. And then we were able to track what happens beyond the coach there. But we ended up doing all those things for the treatment. The placebo, we didn't do anything. They just got the same brochure or the learning catalog that we typically do. And that way, and then when we do randomization, we do a little thing called site randomization. So that way, we avoid 2 groups from the same unit to say that where learning can happen. So we actually randomize it slightly differently. So it could be one primary care site in a county A and a very similar primary care site in a county B, which is not close to A. And this was getting the placebo versus this was getting the intervention. That allows us to do some comparison. So yes, you're right in the sense it has to be very well thought of. Mm-hmm. And so we had some, thanks to this, as you noted down in the article, we had a big machine of statisticians and research designers that helped us out to bring all these parameters, because otherwise the efficacy around the design might be questionable. So those are very good points, though.
And so just as a follow-up, it might be possible, maybe surprising, but possible that a team who didn't get the detailed training about huddles could figure it out, or they could have strong physician leadership involvement that just happens. They could outperform a team that got the more detailed training. But
absolutely.
That's what you have to look at, I guess, a large enough number to make sure it's not higher.
What keep in mind, so what we do in these studies is that we measure the leadership before and after. So going back to your question, it's very possible, very likely for the team in the placebo group to have a strong leader. But guess what? They were strong from the beginning. So what we are measuring is not just whether they're doing better after the huddles, but we're also measuring how are they doing compared to when they started. So the teams that really did well, like in the placebo group where they were all self-motivated, they were always self-motivated. So from the beginning, so we have a pre-huddle survey kind of, we have a post-huddle survey. We do the same thing for pre-huddle and a post-huddle survey for the treatment group, and then we compare. So then you're right. Those things, then it's very likely that those kind of leadership skills and traits always existed. That washes out in these analysis. So this approach is called as the difference in difference analysis. So it's kind of a way to navigate the exact problem that you're referring to, even in the field experiment cases.
Okay. Well, very, very interesting. And in the show notes for the episode, we'll be sure to link to some of the articles that you've had published. so people can take a look at that. And we'll also include a link to the website for the MBOE program there at the Fisher College of Business at Ohio State. If there's somebody who's listening who who's interested, I encourage them to go find information. Maybe final question on the program: what is the cycle for application or somebody expressing interest?
Absolutely. So the program usually starts in December. So every year the program starts in December, and we usually encourage applicants to come in early. So usually and we see this is the peak time for the applications for this program. And we specifically don't have a larger size for this program because of the high touch points of this program. We only have about up to 40 students in the program, because each student gets a coach, and there's lots of learning that happens outside the classroom because they only come in 8 times during the year. And again, COVID has really made us innovate. So we've actually innovated in a lot of different ways, but they don't need to come 8 times a year. They actually can come 4 times a year. And that way they still get the same value. So it starts in December. The application is a rolling application. So it happens all the time, but the peak application actually happens between, I would say, July and October. That's when lots of applicants are. And as you can expect, there's a significant healthcare people in. So I would say one of the beauties of this program, it's by design. A third of our students actually are executives from healthcare. So we have physicians and nurses and PAs. We have a third from, I would call, manufacturing industry, and we have a third from services. And that nature of learning across these things is amazing. So not only what we provide them as Ohio State, but also what learning happens in the classroom, because you have a 40-year experienced postmaster person coming and talking about challenges at USPS to a physician who has the same challenge. He's not having a postman, but he has other things that are having. I think that's fascinating. So by design, it actually allows a lot of learning to happen.
Yeah. Well, I hope people check the program out, because as you mentioned, AC, there's a lot of really, really good graduates from the program. I've had the good fortune to work with some in different aspects, and one of the students I mentored has become a very good friend, and we keep in touch and collaborate on webinars and different things all the time. So Mike, if you're listening, hi Mike. Thanks for
That's great, Mark. And again, we value all the help that you did for the program, so thank you so much.
Well, and thank you, Aravind, for being our guest here today. So really want to thank you for sharing some of your research and your thoughts, and also sharing a little bit about the program. So again, this has been Habitual Excellence. Hopefully everyone will make this habitual listening, and we hope you enjoy, and we'll see you next time. Thanks again, Aravind.
Thank you so much, Mark.